have a chance to talk to you about the most recent decade of the Vietnamese American community in New Orleans. It's an honor for me to give my impressions about your community. It's also a little bit scary. So during the break, I went and turned on my car, and this is my escape route right through here. So please keep the outlet clear in case I need to go. I first became really interested and started working in Vietnam and studying the Vietnamese and Vietnamese Americans in the early 1990s. I had the good fortune to work with Dr. Charlie Hirschman, who's a very famous scholar of Southeast Asia studies. We were doing some work on Thailand, and Charlie's a bit older than I am, and he was fascinated by Vietnam. He was at risk of the war. I was a little bit too young for that. We were working on Thailand, and in 1993, when I started working with him, he had some obligations to go to Vietnam and do some training for some young scholars there and asked me to join him. And I'm so glad that I did. I was immediately impressed with how beautiful the cities of Saigon and Hanoi were and how focused and hard-working the Vietnamese people were. I felt really lucky to be there. This is a photo of me on a more recent trip. Like Heather before, I had the good fortune to have Fulbright recently in Vietnam. And so I was in the area of the north close to Phat Diem and Bui Chu, where many of your elders are from. And the boat lady let me row back a little bit from wherever we were. We're having an argument about who the stronger rower was. It was her, of course, but I wasn't going to admit it to her. But anyway, when I'd come back from these trips, people would ask me what my impression of the Vietnamese was, and my answer was always, they're very resilient people with an interesting culture. But I didn't really know what I meant by that. I started to understand a little bit better what I meant by that as I started to immerse myself in the really wonderful and rich literature that's been written about Vietnam, the Vietnamese, and also about Vietnamese Americans. One of my favorite was written by my colleague Carl Bankston at Tulane, and Min Zhao, came out in the late 1990s. It's called Growing Up American. And the question they're trying to answer is, why is it that your children, the second generation of Vietnamese, why is it that they were faring so well in American society in spite of the fact that their parents, you, had set up their enclaves in sections of cities like New Orleans, in pretty marginal sections of those cities because that's where land was cheap and that's where it kind of made sense to set up. So in spite of all the hazards of inner city life there, they were thriving. And Carl and Min's answer to that question was, there were a lot of features of traditional Vietnamese culture that protected Vietnamese children from some of the hazards of inner city American life. I can't read my slides backwards. So what I decided that I wanted to study in my research was how were Vietnamese in America faring compared to their counterparts who stayed behind in Vietnam. How that turned out is a study for, or is a question for another day. But the main issue for today's remarks is that while I was collecting these data here in New Orleans in the Vietnamese community, this was in the summer of 2005, just a few weeks before Katrina hit. So we had just finished our data collection. We had a lot of measures of this community that I was at first intending to compare to their counterparts back in Vietnam, but all of a sudden we realized that we had the opportunity to follow the recovery of an immigrant enclave after a major disaster, which was, of course, Katrina. So we had these pre-Katrina measures of how people were doing in terms of mental health status, economic status, and things like that. And we were able to kind of follow them both in the short term, 1 year, 2 years. We were able to go back 5 years after. We're getting ready to go back into the field to do a 10-year assessment to see how people are faring after a major disaster like this. Katrina, of course, flooded the entire city. After it struck at the end of August of 2009, we celebrate or commemorating